Her name was Helen. In the summer of 1954, she bought a pale blue shirtwaist dress from a department store in Columbus, Ohio. Helen was 24 years old. She wore that same dress again in 1962 to her son's school recital. Same waist, same woman. 8 years later, by then she had given birth twice, cooked thousands of meals, hosted Sunday suppers, baked pies at Thanksgiving, and never once counted a calorie in her life. Nobody in Helen's kitchen had a meal plan. Nobody had a detox. Nobody was eating clean. Nobody called bread toxic, butter dangerous, or eggs controversial. Nobody needed an app to tell them when to stop eating. They just lived inside a food world that had not yet been redesigned to keep them hungry all day. That is the part people miss. When most people look back at photographs of women from the 1950s, they assume the answer was discipline. That those women were simply tougher than we are. Better at restraint, less tempted, more elegant, more controlled. But that is not what the pattern shows. What it shows is a way of eating so ordinary nobody even thought to name it. A set of habits so built into daily life they did not feel like rules. Then modern life changed the food, changed the portions, changed the timing, changed the marketing, changed the kitchen, and called the result freedom. This video is about the 10 unspoken diet tricks every 1950s woman knew without ever calling them diet tricks. Before number 10, subscribe. This is exactly what this channel is here to make. Not louder advice, clearer memory. Now let's go. Number 10. They did not snack all day. At 10:30 in a 1950s kitchen, you might hear a radio, a broom on the floor, a pot lid rattling, a baby waking up from a nap. What you would not automatically hear was a cabinet door opening for a handful of crackers, a granola bar unwrapped in the car, or someone saying, "I just need a little something." Eating had borders. Breakfast was breakfast, lunch was lunch, dinner was dinner. Between them there was life. Nobody called this fasting. It was just how meals worked when the house was organized around meal times instead of grazing. Hunger between meals was not treated like an emergency. It was often just the ordinary distance between one proper meal and the next. What changed later was not human biology. What changed was an economy that learned how profitable it was to turn every lull in the day into a selling opportunity. Number 9. Breakfast was actual food. A weekday breakfast in 1955 was often small by restaurant standards, but substantial in substance. Eggs, toast, maybe oatmeal, maybe bacon, maybe fruit if it was there, maybe a glass of milk. It was warm. It had weight. It asked you to sit down for a few minutes and begin the day like a person, instead of a consumer in transit. Nobody called it a macro-balanced morning routine. It was just breakfast, and that mattered. Research comparing breakfasts has found that egg-based breakfasts can produce greater satiety than refined bagel-based alternatives and reduce short-term energy intake afterward. In other words, the old breakfast did one very unfashionable thing very well. It held. What Helen had was not a hack. It was a routine. The breakfast industry that came later made its fortune on solving a problem the older breakfast often prevented. It replaced a plate with a package, then sold convenience, as if the body had become too modern to fry an egg. The women in those kitchens were not morally better. Their first meal simply gave them fewer reasons to go hunting for food again at 10:15. Number 8. Their drinks were small and boring. This sounds trivial until you trace it carefully enough. In the 1950s, coffee was coffee, percolated, poured, maybe a spoon of sugar, maybe a little cream. A Coca-Cola was a treat, and the classic bottle held 5 ounces, not the bucket-sized servings that would later become normal. A modern woman can consume hundreds of calories before lunch without ever feeling like she ate anything at all. Sweetened coffee drinks, oversized sodas, bottled teas dressed up as wellness, healthy smoothies that behave like dessert. The 1950s table was less exciting and far less profitable. Water, milk, coffee, soda once in a while. That was the whole drama. She never had to resist the 500-calorie beverage event because it had not yet become a category. She drank things that accompanied food, not things that secretly were the food. Number 7. Sugar stayed visible. The sugar bowl sat on the table. That is the detail. White ceramic, little spoon, maybe a floral pattern worn soft at the edges. It was there in plain sight. And because it was visible, it had a place. It went into coffee. It went into a pie. It went onto berries if the berries were sharp. It had not yet been quietly threaded into bread, sauces, yogurt, cereal, salad dressing in every corner of the pantry. When sweetness is obvious, people relate to it differently. It feels like a choice. When sweetness is hidden, it stops feeling like dessert and starts feeling like the atmosphere. What keeps surfacing when you look at mid-century eating is that the pleasure was real because the frequency was lower. Cake meant birthday. Pie meant Sunday. Candy meant the movies or Halloween or a dish on the sideboard at Christmas. Nobody in 1954 congratulated herself for cutting sugar because she was not fighting sugar in everything else first. She had the treat. She also still had the boundary. Number 6. They cooked from ingredients. A 1950s pantry was not pure or magical. It had its canned goods. It had shortcuts. But it still revolved around ingredients more than formulations. Potatoes, flour, butter, onions, beans, chicken, ground beef, carrots, celery, apples and season. Soup did not have to be homemade every night to come from a world in which cooking still began with recognizable things. This is where the hidden shift comes in. Home cooking protected people in ways they did not have to think about. When you cook from ingredients, you control the sugar because you are the one holding the spoon. You control the fat because it is in the pan in front of you. You control the portion because there is no marketing department deciding what family size should mean. Research from Johns Hopkins found that people who cooked at home more frequently consumed fewer calories, less sugar, and less fat than people who cooked less often, even when they were not trying to lose weight. That is a staggering detail, because it reveals something modern culture keeps trying to forget. Structure often beats intention. Helen never called it portion control. It was just dinner. She never had to decode the ingredient panel on a frozen, better-for-you entree, because dinner was still something she made, not something a factory pre-decided for her. Number 5. They ate at the same hours. Breakfast at 7, lunch near noon, dinner around 6. The exact times varied by town, by factory whistle, by husband's route, by children's school schedules, but the rhythm was there. The body learned the day because the day kept repeating. Appetite had edges. Evening had a meal, not a series of small negotiations with the pantry. Nobody called it circadian alignment. Nobody posted about listening to hunger cues. The cues were easier to hear because the noise was lower. Predictable meals created different relationship to appetite than the modern pattern of coffee, nibbling, postponing, rewarding, and then eating late under bright lights. The old schedule was not glamorous. It was ordinary. That is exactly why it worked. Not because women in the 1950s were stricter in some heroic way, but because the day itself had more shape. A body can settle inside shape. A struggle's inside constant improvisation. Number 4. They moved without calling it exercise. A woman in 1953 might not have worked out, but she worked. Up the stairs with laundry. Down the stairs with sheets. Across the kitchen, through the yard, to the clothesline, to the corner store, back with bags in her hands. She stood to cook. She bent to scrub. She walked children where they needed to go. Even office women moved through buildings, transit stops, sidewalks, errands, and cities that demanded more from the body than tapping a watch and driving everywhere. This is important because modern culture likes to isolate movement into a scheduled event, then charge for access to it. But for many women then, activity was not separate from life. It was built into life. The calories were not burned in neon leggings under motivational signage. They disappeared into the day. She did not need to be told to get her steps in. The house, the neighborhood, and the way tasks were arranged did not let her become still for long. Number 3. The portions were smaller before anyone invented portion control. Pick up a vintage dinner plate from a 1950s set and you feel it immediately. It looks almost delicate by modern standards, modest rim, modest center. It does not dare you to fill every inch. It expects dinner, not abundance, as theater. This is one of those changes that seems cosmetic until it isn't. Research on U.S. portion sizes shows that marketplace servings expanded dramatically beginning in the 1970s and accelerated through the 1980s, with many foods rising far beyond federal standard portions. Larger portions became a selling point. More for your money. Bigger cup, bigger muffin, bigger bowl. But the plate is a script. It tells the eye what counts as normal before the stomach gets a vote. A smaller plate in 1954 did not feel like deprivation because the whole culture agreed on what dinner looked like. Modern people are often told to practice portion control inside an environment specifically designed to make normal portions feel insulting. She did not need portion control as a skill because portion control had not yet been turned into an act of resistance. Number 2. Their food had fewer people trying to sell it to them. This may be the biggest difference of all until you reach number 1. The 1950s were already changing. Supermarkets were growing. Convenience foods were arriving. The frozen dinner was entering American life. But the full industrial machine had not yet completed its takeover. Food historians note that over the last century, branding, processing, restaurant culture, and convenience marketing transformed food from something prepared and shared into something increasingly manufactured, promoted, and eaten on the run. Ultra-processed foods were once rare, then they became ordinary. That matters because appetite is easier to manage in a world that is not professionally engineered to overstimulate it. She was not stronger than you are. She was less surrounded. Fewer packages were trying to bypass her judgment with salt, sugar, texture, color, nostalgia, convenience, and endless shelf life. Fewer companies were studying how to make food irresistible, portable, and impossible to stop thinking about. What changed was not the female body. What changed was the number of industries getting paid when that body became confused. We are almost at number 1, and number 1 is the thing the modern food world spent decades teaching people to fear. Number 1, they ate real fat, butter on toast, whole milk in the refrigerator, cream in the coffee, bacon grease saved in a jar by the stove, chicken skin not apologized for, salad dressing that actually tasted like something. The 1950s woman did not think she was making a bold nutritional statement. Fat was simply part of food, and because food still had flavor, meals could end like meals. Then the culture turned. In 1977, the U.S. dietary goals began explicitly encouraging Americans to limit certain foods, including animal fat, and the wording of that guidance was shaped amid heavy pushback from food industry interests. The decades that followed helped normalize low-fat everything, which often meant products reformulated with more starches, sugars, additives, and marketing. This is not a fairy tale about the 1950s being nutritionally perfect. It was not. But this part matters. When real fat was removed, industry did not respond by making food more honest. It responded by making food more profitable. If butter carried flavor naturally, the replacement had to simulate satisfaction some other way. Usually with sweetness, usually with engineering, usually with another package. She spread butter on bread and called it bread and butter. We turned that into a moral crisis, then built an aisle around the substitutes, and that is the pattern underneath all 10 of these so-called tricks. They were not tricks. That is the truth. The modern world keeps disguising. These women were not staying trim because they had a secret. They were staying slimmer often without trying very hard because their days had shape. Their meals had boundaries. Their food had fewer ingredients. Their portions had limits. Their drinks had restraint. and their kitchens had not yet been fully invaded by industries that profit when appetite becomes confused. Go back to that 1956 kitchen, the butter soft on the counter, the eggs in the pan, the coffee in the percolator. The sugar bowl that meant sugar was a thing, not an atmosphere. The quiet between meals. The dress hanging on a hook in the bedroom. None of it looked like a wellness strategy. That is precisely why it was so powerful. It was not a system layered on top of life. It was life before everything got turned into a system. Older American homes and older American tables were not wiser about everything, but they were wiser about one enormous thing. The body does not do well when every meal, every snack, every drink, every hour, and every craving is being monetized. Modern life did not replace bad habits with better ones. Very often, it replaced ordinary human-sized patterns with products that could be branded, enlarged, sweetened, and sold back to us as solutions. Pick one thing from this list. Just one. Eat breakfast from a plate. Skip the snack. Put butter on real toast. Drink coffee that still tastes like coffee. Come back in a week and tell me what felt different.